Good evening. Good evening, and welcome to the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum. My name is Will Parsons, and I'm a member of the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum Committee here at the Institute of Politics. Before we begin, please note the exit doors, which are located on both the park side and the JFK Street side of the forum. In the event of an emergency, please gather your belongings, walk to the exit nearest to you, and congregate in the JFK Park. Please also take a moment now to silence your cell phones. You can join the conversation tonight online by tweeting with the hashtag #SendCollinsForum, which is also listed in your program. Tonight's events will begin shortly. Please take your seats and enjoy the program.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Doug Elmendorf, the Dean of Harvard Kennedy School. Welcome to the Kennedy School and to the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum. We are delighted and honored tonight to be joined by U.S. Senator Susan Collins. And in a few minutes, I'll be asking her some questions, and then we'll open the floor, and you can ask her questions. But first, we are also delighted and honored tonight to be joined by Harvard President Drew Faust. And President Faust will be introducing Senator Collins, so it falls to me to introduce President Faust. Now, a proper introduction for President Faust would talk about her contributions as one of our country's distinguished historians. Her research and writing on the Civil War and the American South have fundamentally transformed our understanding of the creation of our country. A proper introduction would also, of course, talk about her outstanding leadership of Harvard University over nearly 10 years now. But I talked to President Faust this morning, and she said, no, you shouldn't go into those things, because you've heard them and she's heard them, and we should get right on to the program. So I won't go into those things at any length. But I will just add a personal note. I am so grateful to President Faust for giving me the opportunity to do this amazing job that I'm doing. And I want to thank her for helping me learn how to do it better. I have a lot still to learn, and I look forward to learning much more from her. So thank you, and please let's welcome Drew Faust.
Thank you, Doug. That was very generous, and I don't think that you need to learn a whole lot. You're doing just fine, so thank you. It's wonderful to be here and to participate in one of the signature programs of the Harvard Kennedy School and the Institute of Politics. The John F. Kennedy Forum is a living memorial that has welcomed remarkable public servants to the university, and I'm really honored and pleased to introduce one of them tonight, Senator Susan Collins. She says that she's excited, and I quote her, by bringing people together from both sides and sitting down and figuring out what ideas they have. And she explains her role on the Hill in terms that have become increasingly and unfortunately rare. She's in Washington, and I quote her, not to be particularly ideological, although she says she is proud to be a Republican. But she's there, she says, to solve problems and to work with people who are interested in solving problems. And her workload is extraordinary. Chair of the Senate Select Committee on Aging, Chair of the Transportation, Housing, and Urban Development Appropriations Subcommittee, member of the Intelligence Committee, member of the Committee on Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions. The list goes on. In her 19 years in office, she has not missed a vote. She improves the... I was actually with her once when she had to watch very carefully to run in, and I was so nervous that somehow I might be the cause of her missing her first vote. But it worked out. She improves the lives of her constituents and her fellow American citizens by working with colleagues of diverse political persuasions. It's a commitment that has sparked praise for her throughout her career. Senator Collins is, especially for those of us who have devoted our lives to higher education, a stalwart champion of the long and productive partnership between the federal government and research universities. She believes in the power of science and the promise of human ingenuity. And she supports efforts to advance humanity's understanding of diseases such as Alzheimer's and diabetes. Hope begins in basic science, and we are all so fortunate to have a person of such ability and insight advocating for research in our nation's capital. Before we begin our conversation, I want to take a moment to thank Senator Collins for that work in particular, and for something more. Through this tumultuous and transfixing election season, she has underscored a value that ought to infuse how we live our lives as members of the university community, the national community, and the global community. She has said, the precept of treating others with respect is an idea that should transcend politics. Please join me in welcoming to Harvard a public servant who embodies in word and deed the aspiration for government infused with civility, open to knowledge, and guided by wisdom. Please join me in welcoming Senator Susan Collins.
Thank you. Thank you, that was lovely. Thank you so much. I'm really honored. Thank you.
Well, this is a special treat for me. As you may know, before coming back to Harvard, I spent 6 years as the director of the Congressional Budget Office. So I worked for Senator Collins and the other members of Congress. And it's going to be fun for me to have a chance to sit here and talk with her. But I'm also looking forward, as she's looking forward, to your questions for her. So let me start by asking how you got interested in working for the government, because you had a number of roles in the federal and state governments en route to being a U.S. Senator. What set you on that path?
Doug, before I answer your question, and I promise that I will, let me first thank President Faust for inviting me here. When we met several months ago, she extended the invitation, and I was so delighted that you followed up on it, because then I knew you meant it. And I've had a wonderful afternoon here today, meeting with brilliant scientists on issues that I really care so much about. So thank you so much for that. And I also would be remiss if I did not point out that my Chief of Staff, Steve Abbott, is a Harvard College graduate, and so he's here with me tonight. So you see, I have good judgment as well. And Doug, it's wonderful to be here with you. We did work together in Washington when you were head of CBO, which plays an extremely important role. All of us lobby Doug at times to make sure he gives our bills the smallest possible score for the cost for the federal budget to help us get them through. So let me now turn to Doug's question on how did I get involved in politics. In some ways, it's part of my DNA. Both of my parents were wonderful role models in that they were very active at both the local and state level. Each of them served as mayor of Caribou, Maine, my hometown, and my father was a state senator. In fact, 5 generations of my father's family served in the state legislature. And my mother always became, whether it was something she was elected to or appointed to, the chair of any organization on which she served, including chairing the University of Maine System Board of Trustees, a position that my younger brother Sam now holds. So I think you can say that I grew up in a family where public service was taught as a noble calling, an important obligation, and a way that you can make life better. I also distinctly remember my parents saying to me that you had no right to complain if you weren't willing to get involved. The second incident that I want to share with you, or experience in my life, was meeting the legendary senator from Maine, Margaret Chase Smith, when I was a high school senior. Some of you here today that I met were part of a same program that Steve and I both had the privilege of participating in, and that is the Senate Youth Program, which is sponsored by the William Randolph Hearst Foundation and involves going to Washington for a week. Well, I had never been on an airplane. I had never met a United States senator. I'd never been to Washington, D.C. And here I was, I just turned 18. I was in my senior year at Caribou High School, and I'm going to Washington, and I get to meet the best senators possible, Margaret Chase Smith and Ed Muskie. And Margaret Chase Smith, for reasons that I will never understand but will always appreciate, spent nearly 2 hours talking with me in her personal office. And I would note that at the time she was the only woman serving in the Senate, but she never once referred to herself as a woman senator or talked about what it was like to be the only woman in the Senate. Instead, she talked about national defense because she'd been very active on the Armed Services Committee, and she talked about a host of issues. And I remember when I left her office that I was so proud that she was my senator, and I thought, women can do anything. Now keep in mind that you all know that, but this was back in 1971, and despite the wonderful role models that I had in my own mother and Margaret Chase Smith, you weren't really quite sure of that back then. And thankfully, things have changed. So when I look back at it, although when I left her office, I certainly never envisioned that I would hold her seat one day, I think that was the first step on my journey to the Senate. And 25 years later, I did run for the Senate. And today, I sit at Margaret Chase Smith's desk on the Senate floor, which gives me goosebumps even as I say it.
That's a wonderful story, and it shows the importance of role models and the people who are in positions taking the time to help younger people understand what they can go on and do in their lives. That's a terrific opportunity that you've now had to follow in her shoes.
It is, and just to build on your point about the importance of role models, when my chief of staff's daughter was 8 years old, 8 years ago, and Olympia Snow and I were Maine's 2 senators, she was watching us on TV one night, and she turned to her father and said, "Daddy, can boys grow up to be senators?" And I love that story because it shows how important role models are.
Yes, and I'm the father of twin girls who are twin young women who are 21 years old, as seniors at other colleges, and it's very important to them who they see doing jobs in the world. Can we move on and talk about your becoming a Republican? So, and President Faust alluded to some of this. I'm curious about the politics or principles, the policies that drew you to the Republican Party, and how you see the evolution of the Republican Party over your time in politics, how that affects what you do in the Senate, how you think about your role.
I believe in the traditional Republican values of personal responsibility, individual freedom, free markets, a strong national defense, keeping government out of certain aspects of our lives, although that's an area where the party has moved in a direction that I disagree with, and a belief that government is best when it's close to the people. And those core Republican values are what attracted me to the party in the first place. I think that both political parties over time tend to veer more to the ideological extremes. And then you'll see the pendulum swing back to the center. And we saw this in the Democratic Party when you started seeing southern states abandoning the Democratic Party because they felt that it had become too liberal. And then along came Bill Clinton and Joe Lieberman and many others who started a group that I think was called the Third Way, as I recall. But they started a centrist group of Democrats and brought the party more back to the center. I think it's since that time moved more to the left. In the Republican Party, I'm very much a traditional New England Republican and a traditional Northeastern Republican. I would never, I'm the first to admit, be elected in Mississippi or Alabama. But I fit the state of Maine well. And so in the years that I've served, I've seen both parties sort of veered to the left and the Democratic Party to the right in the Republican Party. And now the Republican Party is probably in a state of chaos, would be the best description for where we are now. But I think the pendulum swings, and I think it's important to stick with your core values and what you believe and try to help the party right itself.
And do you see forces that will come into play in the Republican Party that will pull it back toward the center, as you say? So the current presidential nominee, in addition to all of his unusual personal characteristics, doesn't hold with a number of key tenets of Republicans' views, as I came to know them in my work for the Congress. So does that give you hope that the party is malleable in some ways, or does that make you more worried because it seems to be drifting in some ways even further from what you would view as the traditional Republican values?
After this election, I think you'll see a reassessment of where the Republican Party should be and a self-examination of what we should stand for. And I think that's going to happen regardless of what happens in the presidential election. In fact, at noontime today, I had a couple of people approach me at a lunch I was attending and asked me if I would join in a discussion after the election. And so I think that that will happen. You know, I think in our country, we face some very serious challenges that sociologists, of which I am not one of, have been commenting on, and that is that our country is becoming more and more polarized. And Congress reflects that polarization. There's a wonderful story that Lowell Weicker, who was a moderate to liberal Republican from Connecticut, used to tell. And a constituent came up to him and who was very angry. And he said to Senator Weicker, you know, you people in Washington are all a bunch of liars, thieves, and womanizers. To which Lowell replied, well, it is, after all, representative government. And I think the polarization that you're seeing in Congress and the hyper-partisanship and the excessive politicization of every issue reflects society. So I would say to all the young people who are here tonight that it's incumbent upon you to help us rebuild that sense of community that has been a traditional American value since the founding of our country. And instead, what we're tending to do, and this is happening even demographically, is people are less and less exposed to people who disagree with their views. Think about where people get their information and their news. They tend to go to cable television stations and online news sources that reinforce what they already think, rather than being exposed to alternative viewpoints. And in our communities, we're seeing that Democrats are living more and more in urban centers and inner suburbs, and Republicans are living more and more in rural areas and outer suburbs. So no longer are you encountering someone with different political views as a fellow soccer coach or school board member or just in your community, in your everyday life. And I think that's a real problem.
So I agree very much with that. Let's follow up about about the American people, some of whom you were representing. Stephen Hadley, who was President George W. Bush's national security advisor, as you know, said over the summer, this election isn't just about Donald Trump. It's about the discontents of our democracy and how we are going to address them. So what do you make of the discontents of our democracy? And what should we be doing to address them?
Well, there's no doubt that that discontent and that disconnect is out there and that people are angry. And I believe a lot of people in this country feel that our institutions have failed them. And if you look at Congress, we did accomplish some important bills last year, such as a rewrite of the No Child Left Behind Act, a five-year highway reauthorization. There are several major bills that were bipartisan that did go through. But we also failed on a lot of the big issues because people were not interested in compromising. And the public is understandably frustrated about that. When health insurance premiums are going up by double digits and there are fewer and fewer insurers who are offering policies on the Affordable Care Act exchanges, people say, what happened? I thought healthcare was supposed to be fixed. And when wages have stagnated for years and people are working just as hard as ever and they can't get ahead, they're frustrated. In my home state of Maine, when we've seen so many mills close, 8 in the past 5 years of our pulp and paper mills that are the bulwark of the Maine economy are gone. And these are one-horse towns in a lot of cases. Those mills provided very good jobs, good wages, good benefits, real pensions, and allowed people to have very good lives. And through no fault of their own, and sometimes, and this is one area where Donald Trump is resonating with people, sometimes it is due to poorly negotiated trade agreements or failure to help those affected by them. And economists will look at the overall effect of a trade agreement and say it lowered consumer prices. That's true. But if you are a mill worker who is now unemployed and you've been in a mill for decades and you don't have other skills and you no longer have a paycheck, you don't much care that consumer prices are a little tiny bit lower. And so I think that accounts for some of the frustration. Harvard is very much a notable exception to this, as is the University of Maine system. But when you see institutions of higher education not doing more to try to control costs or give more financial aid to people, it's very discouraging to them. When you see the Supreme Court be talked about in terms of a liberal bloc and a conservative bloc, this is supposed to be the Supreme Court. It's not supposed to be a political branch of government the way Congress and the administration is. When you see the president resort to using executive orders and bypassing Congress, that is frustrating to people and not the way our institutions should work. So I've given too long an answer, but those are some of the areas where I think people are justifiably frustrated and angry and feel disconnected in a way that is very serious. Because if we don't have the public's trust, we can't tackle the big issues that are facing us.
So let's talk more about the Supreme Court. You were part of a bipartisan group about a decade ago that reached a compromise on how judicial nominations would be handled in the Senate. And at that time, the compromise involved some of the nominations that were on the table going through, some did not go through. What do you see that's happened since then? Obviously ending with the nomination of Merrick Garland that is waiting to be dealt with. How do you see what's happened in the Senate, and what do you think might be done going forward?
Well, first of all, Doug, thank you for remembering that back in 2005 that I was part of the group that brought to an end an impasse on the nominees, the judicial nominees of President Bush that were being sent up and were being just stymied. I mean, they were going nowhere. And a group of us, Democrats and Republicans alike, said, this is not right, this is not how it's supposed to be. And we reached an agreement on some of the more controversial judges that were there. And we also set a standard that only, if memory serves me, only in extraordinary circumstances would there be a filibuster against a judicial nominee. And that worked for a while. It broke the impasse for a while. Since that time, I regret to say, it's been pretty much all downhill. And this troubles me because respect for the judiciary, and this is why one of the areas where I was most upset with Donald Trump was when he criticized the judge from Indiana who is of Mexican heritage, Mexican-American heritage, born in Indiana, just as American as Donald Trump. And he said that he could not possibly rule fairly on a case involving Trump University because of his Mexican heritage. And to me, that showed such a disrespect for the role of the judiciary, as well as this particular judge who has an outstanding reputation, that I was very troubled by that. But I am troubled by both parties, and neither party has a monopoly on this, politicizing the judicial nomination process. My friend Joe Biden, and he is my friend, there's an old video that exists of his saying that if there is a vacancy in the Supreme Court during the final year of President Bush's administration, that nominee should not be confirmed. And then we've seen with when Justice Scalia died, my party saying that no nominee, no matter how qualified, should be confirmed. I think they're both wrong. And I think it's dangerous because the Supreme Court is supposed to be above politics. Now, I'm not naive in that way. And as someone once famously said, the justices do follow the election returns, but still, that is supposed to be the one branch of government that is above politics. So and the first thing I did when Justice Scalia died is I got out the Constitution and I read what it said just to refresh my memory, because although I was pretty sure there wasn't any time limit for a president sending up a judicial nominee, I thought I'd read the exact language. Well, the exact language actually says that the president shall, it doesn't even say may, it says shall make nominations. I met with Merrick Garland, and I thought the president was wise in sending up someone who has a long judicial record and a distinguished judicial record. And I interviewed him for more than an hour. And in fact, I have a very good friend who teaches at Harvard Law School, who is from Maine, and I will confess, I called him and I asked, what's the hardest question that I can ask him? And I got advice from my staff, and I did my own research as well. And I interviewed him for an hour, and here's the question that was most important. I asked him, what is your judicial philosophy? And I loved his response because he said, I do not have one. My job is to apply the law to the facts of the case. And to me, that's what a judge is supposed to do. So I've called for him to go through the normal process, have a hearing by the Judiciary Committee. Obviously, that's far more in-depth than I could do in an hour. And there may be a little irony here, because if Hillary Clinton wins, will she stand by the nomination of Judge Merrick Garland? Or will she decide that she wants to go to the left? In which case, will my party say, gee, we should have confirmed him? So this is going to be interesting, and it'll be interesting to see if he is taken up in the lame duck session.
Yes. So let me ask one more question, then it'll be your turn, so you should be getting ready. Let's talk about the next administration and the next leadership of Congress. So suppose that Hillary Clinton is elected president, but that Senator McConnell remains the majority leader of the Senate. What advice would you give to her and to him going forward in terms of both the policies they might consider and the approach they might take to working with each other and trying to move their policies through the process?
I would actually give them the same advice. One is I would ask them to try to identify issues where there is bipartisan support and that matter to the American people, and work together and see if we could actually come up with an early accomplishment that would help restore the public's trust in our government. And I would have two specific suggestions for them. One is the major investment in biomedical research. This is something that would matter to every American family. What family hasn't been affected by either Alzheimer's disease, our most costly disease, by the way, diabetes, or cancer? And if they would come together and commit to a multi-year increase in NIH, National Institutes of Health funding, ways to expedite through the FDA new treatments, new drugs, new pharmaceuticals, and really make that a bipartisan cause. And there's bipartisan support. It's the Republican Congress that added $2 billion to the NIH budget last year, and we're on task to add another $2 billion this year. Second, and let me say, I worked well with Hillary when she was a colleague in the Senate, and I hope that I've been concerned about some things during the campaign, but I hope she'll remember her experience in the Senate, where she did work with members on both sides of the aisle. So my second suggestion is that in Congress, as in any area of professional life, personal relationships matter. And one area where I will be critical of President Obama is that it's obvious he really did not enjoy working with us in Congress. And that's why he often circumvented Congress. And I think he would have gotten more done if he had developed more personal relationships with members of Congress. You know, at the White House, It's pretty easy to entertain people. It's not like you're the one who's going to have to do the cooking or go out and do the shopping, much less the dishes. And I believe that bringing people together makes a big difference. It's much harder to demonize someone that you've broken bread with. And for the leadership in the Senate, I believe that once a week, all of the senators should have lunch together. What happens now is 3 days a week, we have separate caucus lunches. And in those caucuses, and it is necessary to meet separately at times, but 3 days a week. And in those caucuses, not only is information exchanged, and people make the pitches for their bills and their amendments, but also at times you'll be shocked to learn that the leaders on each side of the aisle use those caucus meetings to stir up people, inflame partisan passions, get them angry at the other side, and even, this is truly shocking, mislead them a bit and about what is happening and what the views of the other caucus is on a particular issue. Well, if we were together once a week, it would be far harder for the leaders to do that. Now, that sounds like a really small thing, but I think it would make a major difference.
I agree with you. I think that's just right. From my experience watching members of both sides, occasionally being invited to the separate caucus meetings and watching the group being worked into a frenzy by the leaders.
You've seen it firsthand. And add to that, if the president, whoever that may be, invited the leadership of the House and the Senate, both Democrats and Republicans, to breakfast once a week at the beginning of the week to look at the week ahead. Can they identify areas so they can get together?
Right.
That matters.
Yes, I think you're right, it does. Okay, well, I could happily keep going for a long time, but I want to give other people a chance. So, there are people here who would like to ask questions. And I will just say the traditional line at this point in a forum event is to remind people that questions are short and end with question marks. So please.
Hi, my name is Chetan Javeri. I'm in the MPA program here. Thank you so much for being with us. My question relates to your committee work as the chairperson of the Senate Committee on Aging. And I was wondering if you could talk about your opinion of aid in dying, or also known as physician-assisted suicide. And if you could just talk about your position and what the committee is doing in that regard.
Just to make sure that I got the question, you were asking about assisted suicide, is that correct?
Yes, also referred to as aid in dying.
Aid in dying?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I have been a very strong proponent of hospice care for people at the end of their lives. Surveys show that people overwhelmingly would prefer to be at home surrounded by loved ones and receiving palliative care at the end of their lives. And yet people overwhelmingly die in hospitals hooked up to high-tech equipment, sometimes in pain, and that's not what they want. I believe the effort to expand assisted suicide would virtually evaporate if there were more access to compassionate, home-based hospice care, where people are kept pain-free and are allowed to be where they want to be in the comfort, security, and privacy of their own homes. So in my view, that is a far better approach than expanding access to assisted dying. And I recently held a hearing with Atul Gawande, and he talked about hospice care. And we also had a woman who's in stage 4 of cancer, and she has terminal cancer, and she talked about what a relief it was to her to no longer receive chemotherapy and all the invasive treatments that were maybe going to prolong her life, but were so decreasing the quality of her final months here on earth. So I really think hospice care and expanding hospice care, making it more available, reimbursing it at a higher rate under Medicare so that we would have more people who are willing to go into hospice care is a better approach.
Next question over here.
So my name is Jennifer Piscopo. I'm a political science professor and a visiting fellow here at Harvard. I'd like your reflections or comments on two related issues. One, we often hear about a series of dinners that female senators have amongst each other. And two, what promising initiatives or efforts you see the Republican Party making to recruit more women to run for office within the party.
First of all, it is true that the women of the Senate get together about once a month for dinner. We take turns rotating. There are now 20 women in the Senate. And I'm the senior Republican. Barbara Mikulski is the senior Democrat. And as I was talking earlier about the importance of socializing, I think it's one reason that the women of the Senate work together in a more collaborative way is because we've gotten to know each other through these dinners. Now, I will tell you that one time after these dinners, I was riding on the subway with one of my senior male colleagues, and he said to me, "I hear you women got together for one of those dinners again last night." He said, with great puzzlement, "What do you talk about?" And I just smiled sweetly and I said, "We planned the coup." And the funny thing is, he didn't know whether I was serious or not. And he sort of laughed nervously, not sure what to make of it. But it does help to build trust. Now, I reject totally the concept that all the women senators think alike or we agree on the issues. The fact is, the women senators span the ideological spectrum from very liberal to very conservative, just as our male counterparts do. But these dinners have allowed us to have a comfort zone to share experiences, which women have different experiences running for election than men do. And it does allow us to share those experiences and also to collaborate on some issues and find common ground. I do recruit women to run for public office, and I enjoy doing so. One way I do it is my stealth approach is I have visited more than 200 schools in the state of Maine, because I want those little girls to recognize, just as Margaret Chase Smith taught me, that you can grow up to be a United States Senator or whatever else you want to be. And I so believe role models are absolutely essential. But I'll tell you a phenomenon that I have noted when I do try to recruit women to run for office, and my Democratic counterparts will tell you exactly the same thing, is when I call women and ask them to run, I hear over and over again, "I'm not quite ready. I don't have enough credentials. I'm not well enough prepared." I've called men to recruit them to run for office. I have never had a single male tell me that he was not prepared. With all due respect, I hope I haven't offended the men in the audience, but it's the truth. We women need to have more confidence in ourselves. And I think that's really important. Lynne Barton, former Secretary of Labor and Congresswoman from Illinois, this is really going to offend people, but it once told me that a woman feels like she needs a PhD in economics to discuss international trade. A man just feels like he needs to own a Honda. But, and she obviously was joking, as am I, just so there's no misunderstanding about that. But the point is, there is a lack of confidence that women have. And not all women, obviously, but many of those that I've tried to recruit. And when I talk to my Democratic counterparts, they tell exactly the same story. So it's not a partisan difference.
Thank you. Next question over here.
Hi, Senator Collins. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Amy Larson. I'm a dual degree student with the Kennedy School and NYU Law. I wanted to hear a little bit more about your thoughts on jobs. I worked in Lewiston, Maine with a Kennedy School community development group, and we saw these big, beautiful mills that were empty, and it was really hard to see, and so I related very strongly when you painted the picture of the last couple years of mill closures. What do we tell those families and individuals who have lost those jobs about whether or not they're coming back, and what do we actually do, assuming that they're not coming back?
A great question, and a really important question for our country. As I tour around Maine, I visit businesses all the time. And what I found is there is a real mismatch in the training and education and skills that people have versus the jobs that are available. And I'm sure you found that in your time in Lewiston. For example, I cannot go to a machine shop in Maine and find one that is fully staffed. They're always looking for machinists. We need more machinists. And those are good jobs. They're very good jobs. Same with healthcare, particularly in rural Maine. They need physicians, they need physical therapists, they need nurses, they need all sorts of healthcare professionals, particularly since Maine is the oldest state in the nation by median age. But we're not gearing our education and skills training to the jobs that are there. So I would like to see more collaboration between community colleges, or among community colleges, the university system, and employers, so that they identify the emerging jobs, the jobs of the future. We need more people who are trained in technology and computer science, and we're starting to have more biotech in Maine, but they're having a hard time getting the workers that they need, the employees that they need. I've also called on our wonderful research institutions in Maine, Jackson Laboratories, which you may have heard of, and Mount Desert Biological Labs and Bigelow Labs, who all have the need for scientists. Well, what I have helped them with, and I've helped them secure some federal funding under the EPSCoR program and other federal programs, so that they can have interns from our colleges in Maine and from our high schools in Maine, so that these students get the experience of working in one of these wonderful research institutions that we have in Maine, and realize that those are future jobs for them. I've been a strong supporter of the University of Maine's engineering programs, which is leading the way in the development of deep water offshore wind energy that is far enough offshore. I know this is a sensitive issue in Massachusetts. It's far enough offshore that you can't see it from the shore. And due to federal funding that I've helped to secure, We have had 1,000 students in the last 10 years get paid fellowships in the composite lab that is doing that research. I'm so proud of that and excited about that because that is our future. And I love the idea of Maine being the center in the world for the development of this offshore wind energy and manufacturing the composite blades that we would sell around the world. Why lose that market to China or even Denmark or Great Britain? And they could be made in those old mills. I've seen success stories in those old mills. I was in Biddeford just yesterday where there's lots of development going on, and that's where federal funding can be a catalyst. The Community Development Block Grant programs, which comes out of my committee, or the Tiger Grant programs, which help with transportation infrastructure, or some of the research dollars that have come out of the Department of Energy. The hardest cases, however, are mill workers who are in, say, their 50s, and they are not old enough to qualify for Social Security. They've lived their whole lives in these communities, and there aren't a lot of other opportunities, and it's very hard to retrain when you're in your mid-50s for a new career. But I've seen it done. I remember talking to a mill worker several years ago who went from being a mill worker to a nursing home administrator, and she told her personal story. And given our demographics in my state, she's always going to have a job, I can tell you. And but I think that's the real challenge, and that's why I'm a strong supporter of trade adjustment assistance, which gives some income supplement while the person's retraining. When we lost our mill recently in Bucksport, the local community college had 11 people enroll under the Trade Adjustment Assistance Program, and they've been retrained as fine woodworkers, and each one of them is employed. Many at Hinckley Yachts and other boat builders in Maine that need their skills. But it is tough for older workers.
Thank you. Let's go up here now.
Jay Gleason, in an interview on CNN this summer, you said you wouldn't support your party's nominee because of what he said about Captain Khan, who was killed in Iraq, and whose family was at the Democratic National Convention. But you and Hillary Clinton actually voted to authorize that catastrophic war in Iraq, which not only killed Captain Khan, but hundreds of thousands of Iraqis, which have never been compensated for. Doesn't that render you and her and others that authorize this aggression unfit for office as well?
Well,
or more so?
Let me first say, with regard to Donald Trump, I outlined in my op-ed that I wrote for the Washington Post my reasons why I cannot support him. And you're absolutely right that his lack of any empathy for the Gold Star parents of a soldier who was killed in Iraq was a major issue for me, as was his mocking of a disabled reporter and then denying that he mocked the reporter, even though there's a video of his doing it, and his disrespectful treatment of the Mexican-American judge that I've already mentioned, that those were 3 incidents in particular. I have been to Iraq 4 times, and I have been to Afghanistan 4 times, and I have met with our soldiers and Marines and airmen, sailors, and I have been to the funerals of constituents who have been killed in Iraq and Afghanistan. And I feel tremendous empathy, and I grieve with their families. I did vote to authorize the war in Iraq. I felt at the time, like Hillary, like the vast majority of people in the Senate who voted for the war, that I was making the right decision. I read all of the intelligence reports, including the British intelligence reports that said that Saddam Hussein had chemical and biological weapons. And that turned out not to be the case. I think the first President Bush made the right decision when he liberated Kuwait after it was invaded by Iraq, and then did not go to Baghdad, despite the fact that he was urged to do so. You make the best decisions you can at the time based on the information that you have. And as my chief of staff will attest, I was one of the last people to make up my mind on this issue because I recognize that there is no more difficult decision than authorizing the use of force and sending our young men and women into war. And that is a very tough decision. The person who most persuaded me was Colin Powell, who called me the night before, and I saw your look of disdain, but I have great respect for Colin Powell, and he called me the night before, and I remember his words because he was going to the United Nations, remember, and making the case to the United Nations. And he said, sometimes the best way and the only hope of avoiding war is to use the threat of war, and that's what I want to do through the United Nations in hopes that Saddam will open up his country for inspections. And so I made the best decision I could based on the information that I had at the time.
Thank you. Question over here that may be your last question, I'm afraid.
Thank you, Senator Collins, for taking the time to speak with us tonight. I also wanted to thank you for being among the earliest Republican senators to speak out against the Trump candidacy. As a Maine voter, that meant a lot to me. And you've really clearly articulated, including tonight, some of the risks that face the country if Trump becomes president. But in practical terms, any vote for anyone besides Secretary Clinton makes a Trump presidency more likely, and all of the risks that that brings with it. So could you please explain your thinking in not voting for Secretary Clinton?
Okay. I think, though I couldn't hear your question that well, but I think you said that why am I not voting for Hillary, essentially, to put it in a nutshell. I can't. I believe that she is a flawed candidate, but I will tell you that if she is elected, I will work closely with her. I will not try to obstruct, and I respect a lot of what she has done in her life, including her work for children and families, and we joined together. She was my first co-chair of the Alzheimer's Task Force when I started it in the Senate. And we worked together on a rural development initiative. But I am troubled by the whole email incident. I am troubled by the fact that she said that the head of the FBI exonerated her. He did not. He said that she was extremely careless, was his term, in handling classified information. And it troubles me that she deleted or had her team delete almost as many emails, 32,000, as were turned over. 35,000, I believe, were turned over. I'm troubled by that. I'm troubled by the the allegations involving the Clinton Foundation. I think that once she was Secretary of State, that the Clinton Foundation should have had a wall, an impermeable wall constructed so that she could avoid even the perception that if you gave money to the Clinton Foundation, that it would get you a meeting with her. And there are just too many emails that imply that there was a connection. And that really troubles me. But having said that, if she is our next president, I will tell you that I will work well with her, as I did when we served together as colleagues in the United States Senate.
Well, I'm afraid that we need to wrap up at that point. During my time working for the Congress, I admired, respected, enjoyed working with many members with whom I had a chance to work, but few whom I admired, respected, or enjoyed working with more than Senator Collins, and I think you can see why. Let's thank her very much for being with us tonight.
Thank you. That's very nice of you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.